Right. I don't really need to actually read out your title, because
No,
I think you probably will do it yourself, Professor.
I hadn't thought I would, but I can do.
Well, indeed.
If I can remember, that is, I guess.
Well, it says ecosystem services and sustainable
Oh,
agriculture.
it'll turn up, won't it? Yes, if we can find it.
There we go.
There we are.
Excellent. Lovely. I'll try and keep you some time.
Okay, you're give me 5 minutes more.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Well, thank you very much. Change of pace, I think. Give you a little chance to draw breath and to reflect on the things that have happened so far. I was asked to talk about ecosystem services for agriculture, perhaps for sustainable agriculture. And I thought, no, that wasn't going to do. Actually, what I wanted to talk about, ecosystem services and sustainable agriculture. Sorry, you can tell I'm an academic, you see. I'm sorry about this. And actually what I want to do is to reflect on that point. So I want to think about the position of agriculture within ecosystem services. Because clearly agriculture is both a user of ecosystem services and a provider of ecosystem services. I'm going to be slightly loose, I suspect, with the language, and I don't particularly want to spend time trying to define different sorts of ecosystem services, and I don't want to spend time trying to define sustainable agriculture. But I'll talk a bit about both and use them, I hope, in a helpful way. So what I plan to do is to think about agriculture in an old world context. So I guess essentially a European context or a Japanese context or maybe a Korean context, as opposed to a North American context or an Australasian context, and to think a bit about some of the implications of that. I want to think about ecosystem services and ecosystem disservices. So agriculture both produces costs and benefits, and the way in which we define those costs and benefits determines how we go into policy and the way in which we organize policy, or at least it should do. And I think there's scope here for thinking, because I think we're a bit loose about whether we're defining services and disservices, and sometimes I think we call things services when actually it's really a disservice. I then want to think a bit further in terms of where we might be going, and I'll think very briefly about sustainable intensification and just think about, in principle, the way in which that might, the different sorts of services that agriculture will need to use, and then I want to think about some policy implications of that. So this, I guess, is there, just to tick the boxes of saying, well, we can think about supporting services or regulating services or ecosystem disservices, and puts agriculture in the middle. So we think about the way in which agricultural systems use soils, nitrogen, nutrient cycling, water, and so on, but also the way in which, and I guess the point here is particularly in an old world, they create both valued outputs, commercially valued outputs, and non-marketed outputs, so water supply, soil conservation, climate change, biodiversity, and so on. And to think about agriculture in that center with these things coming backwards and forwards. And we can think about two possible relationships, and there's a difference here, and I think part of the debate about agriculture in the World Trade Organization is that particularly economists perhaps haven't thought through the different sorts of relationships between agriculture and environment. And it partly, I think, is to do with the context within which those agricultural practices are being undertaken. And we can distinguish between what I initially thought of as a new world, and then I thought perhaps more politically correct or more appropriately is to thought of as a resettled world, and an old world. And I want to, sort of, if you like, explain a little bit about what I have in mind for that, and then to think about why that matters. And actually it takes us back to the point about what we use as our reference level, what it is we're trying to get to, what we think is a good, well-managed ecosystem. And clearly it isn't necessarily going back to a particular point before human settlement. But even that, of course, is a rather indeterminate position. So if we think about a new world or a resettled world, say like North America, or I guess the picture here is New Zealand, because that's where I was doing this, modern agriculture has, in a sense, been overlaid on top of a pre-existing something that might have been called a natural environment. And I guess many of these things are not natural even before Western settlement or the introduction of intensive agriculture, because there were pre-existing agricultural systems or land management practices that were making substantial difference to the nature of the natural environment. This probably isn't the time to say something about calling an organization, putting natural in the title of an organization, and whether this is or isn't a good idea. But it seems to me that there's a slightly this may not be politically correct here. I thank you for the invitation to Wales. But I guess the point is that there is an issue about what it is we're trying to get to and what we think is good. And I think in most of Europe, I suspect, what we're trying to get to is not something that is in the sense in which we normally use the term natural. So the point here is that if you introduce an intensive agricultural system or a modern Western conventional agricultural system into a pre-existing environment, almost invariably it causes costs because it undermines the things that we value in the environment. So where we do that, then we'll say that agriculture is causing an external cost. It's causing an impact in terms of water pollution, loss of biodiversity, soil erosion, and so on. It's causing an impact within that particular context. Then if we say, well, part of the problem is that we've been maintaining higher prices for agricultural output through policy. What happens if we reduce those prices? The consequence is we reduce our agricultural intensity, and almost by definition, we find that the environmental impact is reduced and we get a better environmental quality as a consequence of the reduction of agricultural output prices. And therefore, economists have argued that reduction of agricultural protectionism must be good for the environment. On the other hand, if we contrast that with what we might think of as an old world or resettled world environmental impact, then what we argue here is that agriculture and ecosystem services or environmental impacts can be joint products, that we produce these things together in varying combinations, but actually many of the things that we value from these sorts of systems, the biodiversity, the landscape, and so on, actually are joint products. They're products of a particular system. If we took the system away, we would not have those agricultural outputs. And these, if you like, in OECD terms, non-commodity outputs, but I guess in this context, ecosystem services, cultural ecosystem services, I guess, have co-evolved with our produced output. These two things have evolved over time. So our agricultural systems have created, I guess, ecosystem niches or biodiversity niches where particular sorts of species and habitats have been created that we now value. Whether we would value them with a different starting point is an interesting question, and one that we've begun to think about, but not very much. It's not so long ago I was involved in a task force looking at upland farming, and my naive quasi-economics perspective said, well, there must be some sort of optimal amount of upland land in this particular sort of state that we would like to have. Maybe we've got too much. And actually, it wasn't even possible to ask that question 10 years ago. I think it is now possible to ask the question about whether we want to see more radically different systems and how we might value that. But we've not gone very far, I think, in thinking those sorts of things through yet. So the point is agriculture and ecosystem services can be complementary, that we can produce both together through the same sort of system. And so a reduction in that case, a reduction in agricultural prices may cause a loss of ecosystem services. We can't say in principle whether reducing agricultural prices is going to be good or bad for the environment. And so, in a way, this is a rather trivial slide, but having got the photographs for a different cause, I thought I'd stick them in anyway. But the point is that we want a certain level of positive management in order to achieve the environmental qualities that we value. So we can think about the very extensive, or if you like, the abandoned at one extreme, the well-managed, productive landscape, or too intensive, where actually it's causing both a loss of the outputs that we are pricing and the outputs that we're not pricing. So in that sense, perhaps slightly more technically, but also pretty simplistically, we can think about an area of land as producing combinations of, well, I guess, non-priced ecosystem services and priced agricultural output, and we can have a production possibility frontier, and we would clearly aim to be on it, but the point is that at different sorts of stages of intensity, we can increase the value, and then after a while we reduce the value. So there are non-linearities here. It is part of the complexity of the system that we're trying to find particular levels of intensity, particular agricultural systems And it's tempting to say, certainly with this sort of diagram, it implies perhaps that we go back to historical agricultural systems, but clearly that's simply not feasible. We need to rethink what sorts of agricultural systems can fit into these different sorts of positions. So we need to think about whether the services that we're providing are valuable or whether they're goods or bads in economics terms. So we might say the provision of habitat for birds, which we tend to think of as a benefit, we tend to think of this as a service, an ecosystem service, but we could simply set the reference point somewhere different and say that a failure to provide the biodiversity is an ecosystem disservice. And I guess the point I want to emphasize here is that this is a social judgment. It's not a technical question. It's a social judgment about what duties we think landowners should have. And typically we'll say with habitat and biodiversity, providing space for biodiversity as a service, and typically we might say with nitrate emissions now, 20 years ago we would have said something different, but now I think we would say that leaching is a disservice. But we could say, and actually we do in policy terms, and part of my reason for emphasizing this is that I think we're not very clear about what we're saying in terms of rights and duties. We could say that buffer strips are a service. Now we can get away with that if you like, because we have a reference level of environmental quality, and if you fail to meet that, then it's a disservice, and if you go beyond that, it's a service. So what we need to do, and the point here is we need to be clearer, I think, about the counterfactual. We need to be clearer about the world we are assuming would be in place if we weren't in the place we're in. So where else could we be, and what's the difference between where we are and where we could be? And that involves a judgment, a benchmark of social judgment about good agricultural practice. And so we need somewhere to start from, and that benchmark shifts. So, as I said, 20 years ago, we used to say that farmers ought to use more nitrogen, that actually good farmers, good agricultural practice involved more use of fertilizer, more intensive production, more grass, and so on. Then we thought more about the consequences of that. We recognized the consequences perhaps in the past. We knew that that intensive use of nitrogen fertilizer causes change in river habitats, but we simply regarded that as a consequence, just one of those things. It's a consequence of agricultural practice. If you like, a consequence of good agricultural practice, and intensifying was regarded as agricultural improvement. So our judgment changes. So our judgment about the sort of world we want and the nature of the environment that we want to establish changes. So our social judgment about the duties and rights of landowners changes as well. So there is, if you like, and if you like, you say this is perhaps a present sort of judgment about where we stand. We've got services, so we tend to say that provision of landscape, provision of biodiversity and public access, and maybe carbon sequestration, and I guess we need to think about that. Maybe these are all things that produce benefits. On the other hand, we can say soil erosion, water pollution, pesticides in the environment, atmospheric emissions, and here, again, carbon dioxide emissions maybe. These are, if you like, forms of damage or pollution for which we should expect landowners to have a duty to look after these things. So we can think about ecosystem services, external benefits, or ecosystem disservices, external costs. And that leads us, and the point here is, that leads us into a policy approach. So either, I guess, the conventional view about pollution, the polluter pays principle, or the obverse of that, the way in which we treat the provision of external benefits, landowners doing something beyond what we might expect and require of them, the provider gets principle. And I guess I would emphasize the provider gets principle because we're trying to influence the decision maker's behavior. We might say the beneficiary pays principle, and that's, if you like, becoming, I think, more important as we think about ecosystem services and we think about the beneficiaries from ecosystem services being encouraged to find the resources to help pay for the provision of ecosystem services. I nearly took this out because I thought this is probably too simple for you, but nevertheless it's there as part of the story, I think, about thinking about the nature of ecosystem services and, if you like, the institutional context and, again, the way in which we go about policy. So the characteristic definition of public goods is that there's an issue about rivalry, an issue about excludability. So rivalry where one person consuming the resource reduces the amount of resource available for others, or excludability where if you provide the resource, how easy is it to prevent other people from consuming it? And we can think of situations where we have high rivalry and high excludability, so conventional marketed products, because in this circumstance you can create a market for wheat or renewable energy or timber or whatever. At the other extreme, where we have low rivalry and less excludability, so we can think about an attractive landscape. One person's consumption of it doesn't reduce the quality of it for someone else, in the absence of congestion. If you have it, it's hard to keep people out. It's expensive to keep people out. It's not necessarily impossible. And if you like, the ultimate, I think, is existence benefits. If we value the environment of the rainforest simply because we know it's there, then my enjoyment, my appreciation of that knowledge isn't reduced by the fact that you know it. So it's very close, and we can't exclude people from knowing about it. So existence values are very close to being pure public goods. But the point is that most ecosystem services are somewhere within this range of areas. So if we think about the principles for sustainable agriculture, then these are from Jules Prichard, and I guess what I really want to think about is, in a way, the last one particularly. So we want to integrate biological and ecological processes, minimize the use of non-renewable inputs, substitute human capital for external inputs, and add coordinated action for collective agricultural and natural resource management. So it's clearly making more use of ecosystem services. And if we want to take that further and think about sustainable intensification, so the argument is, and I think it's fairly secure now, we're going to need to increase production at a global level, and I guess that implies all of us. It implies that the market will change. There's probably less discussion about the consequences of these sorts of threats in terms of population, climate change, resource degradation, and so on. They will have price effects. So they will affect all of our incentives. So requirement to increase global production, constraints on land, increase in demand for increasing environmental sustainability, because what we're doing now is not sustainable. But it doesn't specify a particular sort of system, and clearly we need to reorient our research and development in order to think more about what that means. But in very simple terms, perhaps we can say, actually probably what it does mean is a rebalancing of the inputs into our agricultural system. We're going to use less imported inputs, external inputs, fossil fuels, organic chemical fertilizers, chemical pesticides. If we reduce something but we're trying to increase the output, fairly obviously we're going to have to increase something else. So what are we going to increase? Well, technology. We can change the technology. It makes our system more efficient. We can add information about learning about particular, very specific places and how to manage those places best using information, being more precise about how we use pesticides and so on, but also using more local ecosystem services. So perhaps making sure that we're making better use of pest management or pollination, making use of on-farm nutrients to a greater extent through waste management and crop rotations, using renewable energy on-farm, perhaps through anaerobic digestion. But at the same time, we're also saying, well, we want to produce more external benefits, more ecosystem services, so perhaps more space for biodiversity somehow, more carbon sequestration within these systems, better landscapes and better public access. So we're trying to do all these things at the same time, and it's not obvious how we do it, but it does imply ecological intensification. It implies that we're going to have to use the ecosystems within the locality more intensively than we have done in the past. So soil formation, nutrient cycling, nitrogen fixation, biological pest control, crop pollination, water control and management. So the argument here is then that implies a different sort of scale. It implies more coordination across space than the previous model of a conventional agricultural system where, particularly in the post-period after the Second World War, in essence what we've said is we want to give all the resources and control to the individual farmer to make sure that they're well informed and they can buy their inputs, and actually the individual farm model of an individual farmer, his own or her own land in a particular place, works very well for that model. But if we think more about sustainable intensification or ecological intensification, the implication is that we need to think more spatially at a different sort of scale. And that has institutional implications for linking farmers in terms of biodiversity in large-scale areas, water management, storage, flood protection at a local scale, water quality in a catchment scale, economies of size in farm management, marketing and value-added, collective agri-environment contracts, discussion groups, social learning, all those sorts of things. All of those are to do with getting local land managers within a locality to communicate and to coordinate their behavior in some way or other. So that has implications, if you like, of where we've got to, that often our agricultural systems both produce and use ecosystem services, that we need to think, reflect, and change, perhaps, our definition of good agricultural practice. That we need to think about the public good qualities, or the quasi or the near public good qualities of our ecosystem services, and then coordinate across holdings. And we can think about that in policy sense in terms of the benefits that our policy is going to generate, either in terms of public benefit or in terms of private benefits. So some of these benefits are going to provide benefits both to the individual landholder and to the individual landholder, and to external benefits. Sometimes they're going to cause costs to both sides. Sometimes the benefits will exceed the costs. Sometimes the public benefit will be greater than the private benefit. And so the point here is that if we're to the northeast of this horizontal line, then we can do it's worthwhile, and we need to think about the policy implications. So what we can do is to think about policies providing ecosystem services in each of these different areas, and it leads us into a different sort of policy approach. So if you like, in one area, and I should have labeled the areas, but to the left of the vertical axis, we've got ecosystem services, so we can think about public procurement of ecosystem services, or payment for ecosystem services. Or maybe think about stewardship. So this isn't necessarily an economic approach, it's about thinking about what is the best institutional environment to promote particular sorts of outcomes. Alternatively, we can try and think about changing the system, and maybe by collective action, we can actually relocate some of these policies into different parts of that diagram. So where that takes us is to think about regulation, to think about collective provision, to think about coordination, and to think about payments for ecosystem services. And we can think about collective institutions, which I won't do because I'm running out of time. We could also think about how we use CAP reform. And I thought in a European context, we should think about how we use the single farm payment. If we've missed the chance to reform CAP in a positive and helpful way, he said, and that may be controversial, I'm not sure, but we need to think more about targeting policy in particular places. So maybe we can think about the ecological focus area, if you like, as space within which we can use policy mechanisms to achieve something more positive. So 3 things to finish with: that we need to clarify our social judgments about the distinction between services and disservices. We need to think more about the value of ecosystems to individual farm businesses that we've rather ignored in the past. So this isn't simply saying ecosystem valuation, this is saying what is the contribution of these to particular farm businesses. We've said a bit about, we've looked a bit recently about pollination, but other services too. And then finally, to think about institutions for collective action and how those work, how they get information, and how we can operate at a bigger scale than the individual holding. Thank you. Sorry.
Lovely. Thank you very much indeed, Professor Hodge. A very, very stimulating presentation indeed. Now, pressing questions. Do I see a hand? Don't forget, is that troublemaker Everard? There we are.
I want to go back to the first bit of the presentation about the New World and the Old World agriculture. Essentially, I think the key might be in the words new and old, frankly. We don't think in the UK of baseline condition as being wildwood, and its progressive loss, wildwood, and progressive loss since Iron Age and accelerating in Roman times. For those of us obsessed with water meadows, you know, most modern people don't know what a water meadow is. They assume you're talking about a flood meadow. So that's not their baseline. The baseline becomes what you grew up with. And the psychological difficulty of thinking about long-term change and rational baselines, and workable baselines, is probably the key thing here. So the new agricultural condition is what, you know, young Americans grew up with, and so is the norm. So we don't notice the progressive change and generally degradation. So it's a psychological trick there to call it old and new. It's just this inability to see change over longer timescales that is the concern.
It must be right, and there's a tendency to regret what has changed in our lifetime. So in a sense, the benchmark is, yes, what we grew up with, but we need to think longer term what it is. But I think really what I'm saying is we need to think more carefully about what it is we value and what we want to get out of a system that we can redesign to reproduce those things that we value. And maybe we need to be more flexible about what we value, to work out what is really important and what is, if you like, just a nostalgia for, well, we haven't got it anymore.
It links to what Sabine was saying about moving to a function.
Yes.
Well, lovely. Many thanks, Professor Hodge. Don't forget, you do have the opportunity to speak to him later in the plenary session, so all is not lost now if you're a little bit lost for words. Can I speak?
Just mention that these talks, by the way, the presentations, I don't know when I've been out of the room if anybody's mentioned, they will be up on the conference website available for you. We'll check with all the speakers. There's nothing unpublished that needs to, or if that needs to be redacted, it will be. But yes, all the presentations will be there, and later in the day we'll talk about other outputs that are coming from the conference as well. But you will be able to get the actual presentations if you haven't had a chance to ask, or if they've rushed slightly because of time.
Right. Lovely. Thank you very much indeed, Sean, for that.